Grant. Can I just say that I'm very glad to be here this morning, and particularly glad to be at this conference, and I would like to commend the Standards Council for Scotland for the work that you've done over the years, as we have struggled to establish similar style bodies in Ireland. We have certainly been both impressed and influenced by the work you have done, by the way you have approached it, and by the way in which you have gotten over that binary divide between are we or aren't we in these fields a profession, or are we just sort of some sort of do-gooders, you know. So congratulations. I know it's an ongoing debate, I know it's an ongoing discussion, and I'm going to come back to it. But I would like very specifically to congratulate all of you who've been part of that discussion and that debate so far. Secondly, I'm glad to be here because I do believe there are a number of similarities between what we do in Ireland and what you have been doing here in Scotland. One of them is not our capacity in Ireland to be slightly late for everything, and I was a little bit impressed by your un-Celtic approach to be starting properly on time this morning, but well done. We could do it a little bit more of that maybe sometimes as well. Thirdly, I'm glad to be here as somebody who has given most of my life to work in this area, some of it indeed working with the Irish community in the UK many years ago during the 1970s. It wasn't, I might say to you, a particularly easy time to be Irish in this part of the world. And I believe very strongly that those of us who are involved in education or training for community work or for youth work or indeed for adult education should be doing it. I do not believe in this notion of an academic who has something to say in any of these fields and is not actively involved in an ongoing basis on making and shaping the profession. I don't believe these professions can be made or shaped by the bits of paper that some of us don't write, by the way, but that I don't believe that they can be made or shaped by those bits of paper only, although all of us need to do more of the bits of paper as well. But I do believe it's really important that we combine those. The in term at the minute is pandemic. I don't choose to use that. I choose to call myself a community worker who happens to be involved also as an academic in third level education. And I think it's really important to start from there. It's a little bit about where do we start from and where do we end up and how do we move it forward. Now, what I would like to do this morning is to speak a little bit to a number of things. Do I need this one or can I use that one? Because then I might be able to manage all the bits of paper in my hand. Not to mention, maybe somebody kind in the audience will tell me when I've spoken for 17 and a half minutes, because I'm not knowing, or neither are any of us known for being good at shutting our mouths when we ought to shut them. Could I also say, finally, why I'm glad to be here, I'd like to acknowledge I have been for a little while now a member of the board of the International Association for Community Development, and I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of the Scottish Government to the International Association for Community Development, including through supporting conferences, the conference that was held in Glasgow last year. Again, these are not uncontested spaces, and I think they're ones that we need to continue to contest as well. Now, what I'd like to do is speak to four things. Why now? Why is this a good conversation to have now? Why can we talk to each other? What creates the conditions where all of us in this room can talk to each other? And I was really interested in Alison's approach. I've been saying it to students for years. If I come into this room in 6 months' time and find you sitting beside the same person that you're sitting beside now, it doesn't say much for your capacity to engage or do community development or to do youth work either, for that matter. And inevitably you come in 3 years later on the last day, and guess what? The ones that hugged the radiators the first day are still hugging the radiators on the last day. So I want to talk a little bit about why we can talk to each other, a little bit to use our sort of shorthand jingo about where we're at and a little bit about where can we go from here. I'd suggest to you that this is a key moment globally. The neoliberal hegemony has been challenged a little bit. There is a neoliberal hegemony, let's be clear, and if we look what happened to the Greeks in Europe, if we look what's happened under the Millennium Development Goals, to all of the countries in the south, particularly the African countries, it's very clear and very obvious that there is a neoliberal hegemony globally. But I think it's an interesting moment because that hegemony has been challenged in various ways by various movements. It's also been very explicitly challenged by what I choose to call the migration crisis. And I use the term deliberately because I'm sick to the teeth of that spurious distinction between economic migrants and deserving refugees. You know, it's a nonsense. And the sooner we begin to unpack that, the better. All of the people, be they refugees, so-called, or migrant workers, so-called, are all part of a big migration, and there is a migration crisis. We choose in Europe to focus most explicitly on the movement to Europe, but there is a very big migration crisis that's facing the Rohingya people in Burma, for example, who are being literally obliterated and denied citizenship, denied their very identity and their very existence. And we choose, I'd have to say, in this part of the world, not to pay too much attention to that, since it's unlikely that those unfortunate people will get here unless conditions are created where they can come here. It's a key moment also, I think, because of the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN conference in New York last week. Now, I know you're sick to the teeth of these various things, like the Millennium Development Goals did not achieve as much as we would have liked, and they were focused only on the South. But the Sustainable Development Goals are focused, all 17 of them, and they do include ending poverty, and they do include the idea of a partnership between all governments, all peoples and all communities. I think they're quite important, and each government has agreed that they will set a national plan around the Sustainable Development Goals by, I think, about next Easter, and that they will put in place targets. I believe that creates a key moment for all of us in these areas of work, a key moment in which to begin to hold up another mirror to the governments of the countries that we're part of. What's liable to happen, unless some of us do hold up a mirror, is that every government will just adopt what they already have in the various programmes that you've already spoken of this morning. They'll just adopt what you already have, warts and all, and tick those boxes as part of the plan to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an opportunity. All of the countries in Europe were explicitly behind the Sustainable Development Goals, even the UK government, and I think we need to use that moment in order to turn around what we can turn around. And lastly, I think it is a key moment as well, locally and nationally in the Scottish context. You do have the Community and Young People's Act, and you do also have the Community and Empowerment Act and the related community learning and development strategies. Now, I know some of you will have challenges and questions with regard to those, and I'm absolutely clear because we have the equivalent in Ireland in local government reform, when the language of our professions is getting used extensively and almost exclusively without any real understanding of what it is on one hand, or any real evidence that the principles and standards which you've been speaking about and which we've struggled to develop are going to inform the strategies that are developed under the heading of community development or community participation or community empowerment. But I have to say, the fact that these acts exist and the fact that they are using the language that we use gives us a starting point, and one which I think we should be prepared to try to use in any way we can. It's too easy to just throw up our hands and say, one more time, here they go. You know, I think this is an opportunity. We need to use it, and we need also to look to the alliances that can be created across people from different sectors, and I'm sure that in this room there are some of you who work for local authorities, some of you who work for NGOs, and some of you who are involved in different spaces in different organisations. I think this creates the Millennium Development Goals, the global crisis, and the various things that are happening nationally, which can be reinterpreted locally, create a new moment for cooperation between us. So, my second question was, why can we talk to each other at all? And I have, and you'll have to forgive me for this, focused a bit more on community development than other things in some of these slides, but I will talk to lots of other things as well, don't worry. I would say we can talk to each other because we know what we're talking about in a nutshell. And we know what we're talking about because we recognise community development, and I'm very interested in the Scottish and Irish traditions here. We're not about social work writ large, and I've nothing against social work, it does a very good job, but community development as it's understood in Ireland or in Scotland is not about just putting together all the people who have the problem and making sure there's a good individual outcome. It has a different starting point. It is a starting point point in resistance? Is it a starting point in sometimes adult education? Is it a starting point in trade union activity? And so it's about collective in analysis, collective in action, and collective in outcomes. It's not just an outcome for me, it's an outcome for the whole community. But from that point of view, I think we also, when we're talking to each other, we're good, I think, and we need to recognise the difference between creating the conditions for community development, which is your personal development programme or the various other things that you do, doing community development, which is the action that leads to the collective outcomes, and then managing the outcomes when you've gotten the creche or gotten the library or gotten the enterprise off the ground. There's another job. And I think sometimes we conflate all of those and call them all community development. They're a part of the overall process, and a very useful part of the overall process. But if we throw them all into the one bag, we do nobody any favour. And what you end up with is personal development programmes as community development with no outcome that goes beyond that, and managing the local enterprise as community development without the local enterprise having been started through a community process, or without it actually having any sort of community development approach in the work that it does. I would say also we can talk to each other because we know about the difference between collective interests and individual needs multiplied. And I think that's an important starting point for our conversations. Indeed, whether it's about youth work or about community education or about community development, recognising collective interests as the thing that moves us forward, as opposed to individual needs only, or certainly individual needs multiplied. I know in youth work the focus is on the individual development of the young people, and I know also that sometimes youth workers feel this is a big job and it takes 24/7, and I'm well aware that it does. But unless youth workers get involved in representing the collective interests of young people, you'll be doing that job 24/7, 365 days a year for 70 plus years. So it is really important that that sort of collective interest dimension, I feel in all three of the areas that you're dealing with here, is an important one. Secondly, I think in talking to each other, we recognise and need to recognise the difference between consciousness raising and capacity building. Now, you'll probably get the money for capacity building. It's easier to get money for capacity building. Make sure that people can manage better with what they haven't got. You know, and it's the language of the funding application. But if you confuse the language of the funding application with what you hope to achieve out of it, then you're going to limit you're going to end up in a very frustrated situation in 6 months' time. And then lastly, I think we can talk to each other because we see what we're doing, and I'm talking in particular here about community development, as linking advocacy, activism, analysis and action. In the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a fragmentation. So there's people who are employed as professional advocacy workers, or advocates, or people who lobby in Parliament and this, that and the other. I fail to see a huge difference between some of them and the old Victorian sort of ladies of the manor who sort of interceded with their husbands who were running the country on behalf of the poor. You know, I mean, I think it's just a different approach to same. You need to put these things, all need to be together in the one type of situation so that we ourselves are responsible for driving the processes forward. Now, maybe there's nothing wrong with some of them. Probably some of you are advocacy workers. I better be careful. But, and then, you know, activism. Community workers are saying, oh, you're not activists. A community worker that isn't an activist is not really doing their job. Action is a part of the role and a part of the job. Now, community work can be then, and I think it's useful to see it, particularly when we're talking in this thing, an unwaged activity, and so indeed can youth work. It can be an unwaged activity. It can be a method or approach, or it can be a waged professional activity. But I think what's important for all of these, and not just for the waged professional activity, by the way, is that there are transparent standards, methods and principles which inform it. And I think this is where your Standards Council comes in, that there is what I choose to call accountable autonomy. And this is a challenge sometimes to funders as well at the moment. And then I think we need to start finding ways to distinguish between various things. For example, sometimes we lump all of these areas together. Community work equals youth work, and this thing called community youth work, or community and youth. I don't think we do either community work or youth work a favour if we do that. If we talk about, for example, a community development approach to youth work, or a community development approach to community work, community education and learning, I think we can be clearer, because we're not pretending they're all the same. But on the other hand, I think it is useful sometimes, and you can actually do community development work with young people. And community education can be community development as community education. So community development work with young people is not focused on the individual outcomes for the young people in the group. It's focused, as a colleague's work in Ireland was, on achieving third-level education for asylum seekers. And community education as community development is not just about doing the area profile or the analysis as part of the diploma so you get it nice and neat at the end. It's about activity and action and group development that continues long after the so-called learning process has ended, and that moves into a more informal context. Moving swiftly on then. Oh, did I forget something? Oh, I didn't know. Where we are now. I think we need to be, when I was thinking about what would I say about where we are now, it's, again, I feel, over the past 30 years, we can look, I think, in this country or in Ireland, to substantial evidence of outcomes and impact from all of the activities that you have been engaged in. I'll give two examples from Ireland. I don't think it's my job to tell you what are the examples from your own context. But there's a small village in the west of Ireland called Gletterfrack, in a very beautiful, isolated part of the country in Connemara, which is west of Galway, northwest of Galway. And a community group started there approximately 30 years ago, I think now, and they sort of had the gumption to get some money, get some loans, and develop a set of thatched cottages, which nearly bankrupt the people that were involved. And then one of the most infamous industrial schools where children were abused in the country was being closed down and was up for sale, and the local community decided, with some support, to buy it. Over a period, they did get various injections of funding, including from the European Union poverty programmes. But if you look to Letterfrack now, if you compare it to 30 years ago, a beautiful village, but clearly in decline, with very few people there. There now is, and some of the outcomes of the process are an internationally known third-level furniture school, which provides education in designer furniture or in fairly unique furniture for a whole group of young people who come into the village every year, stay in local houses. You have a variety of local projects, some of which are focused on older people who live in isolated conditions, and some of which over the years have been focused in challenging conditions in a rural area, on domestic violence and on the issues being experienced by women. So even physically in the area, when you drive into Letterfrack now compared to 30 years ago, there's evidence of a vibrant community with buildings that show it, but more importantly, what there is evidence of interest and capacity and ongoing engagement. When I look to one of the most deprived areas of Dublin, the south inner city of Dublin, where 30 years ago there was a number of issues with regard to drugs, and of course there still are issues with regard to drugs and associated problems and oppression of people in that area. But a small project, Rialto Youth Project, engaged in a very direct way with local young people. And as a consequence, there's a very, very vibrant by now youth centre, youth programme, and engaged in a variety of creative practices, including in particular the use of youth drama and the engagement of the Irish Museum for Modern Art, which happens to be based quite near to that area, and previously might not have had very much engagement with local projects. So the engagement with them and with, say, another small estate, St. Michael's Estate, which has been knocked down, but the project still continues. So sometimes what I'm saying to you is, if you think about things in the longer term, the sort of outcomes and the sort of impact that we're asked to have is frequently one that you can't demonstrate unless you're able to allow for a longer sweep of history. So I'm sort of challenging the idea of preordained programs with preset programs with preordained outcomes and preordained impact as one of the things that provides a great difficulty for any of the areas that we're engaged in. Secondly, I think the challenge and opportunity of institutionalization and of language and recognition, which I spoke to earlier, is one of the things that we're grappling with. And we're also grappling with the pressure for moderation and incorporation, which downplays the difficulties, the structural difficulties, which create and sustain inequalities. And lastly, because I'm conscious of the time and I just want to move on to where we're going, is the challenge, the oppression of oppression. I'm always amazed at the extent to which we hark back to the deserving poor. Them Romanians ought to be nice. Those, I mean, people experiencing poverty, inequality, racism, and structural discrimination ought to be nice. Why should they? Why would they? And why wouldn't there be difficulties between people who are struggling to address those sort of areas? We're challenged also by ideas of professionalism and professionalisation. And the sort of profession that we are is how I would put it. Because what we need to do is maintain credibility and resist the fragmentation of deprofessionalisation. It's many years ago since I think it was somebody wrote in one of those old community workbooks, it's not a question of whether or not we're a profession. And I think that stands for both youth work and also for adult education. It's a question of the sort of profession that we are and how we actually articulate the uniqueness and get beyond the ambivalence, which we rightly associate with very closed professions. And how do we create the standards and the ethics that echo that sort of uniqueness, which is not the same as all you need to do is have good intentions. Good intentions, quite clearly, are not good enough, and they're not good enough to serve the communities and the young people and the processes that we're engaged with. Where to from here? Can I just say one or two very brief things? I think there are a couple of things that we still need to focus on. We need to get in the process of mainstreaming marginalised peoples and minorities needs to go beyond inviting them to join us. We had Jim Ive from Australia, who writes about human rights and community development, last week in Maynooth, and he was giving out about this close the gap syndrome, close the gap so they get more like us. So mainstreaming is an important phenomenon, but it needs not to be about assimilation, which it often can be. Secondly, gendered communities and gendered relations of oppression are a starting point. They remain a starting point, and unless we name them, and unless we name the oppression of women, whether it's women from the majority or women from the minority, and do so in terms that empower women, we don't have a legitimacy in the professions that we're part of. Thirdly, common sense, which is what the people see, and critical knowledge are needed. And by that I don't mean that quasi-intellectual obfuscation with hidden ideologies underpinning it, which passes for analysis sometimes. Fourthly, I think the creative tension and informed critique that our professions can bring, that creative tension needs to be mainstreamed as something which in the end is a critical and supportive part of developed democracies, which your country and mine choose to call themselves to be. That creative tension, that holding up of a mirror, is an absolutely critical part. And I believe that our professions are a critical part of maintaining that creative tension. We have a job, I think, as well, to manage and get beyond acceptable levels of dissent. There's always an acceptable level of dissent with regard to how you can inform policy making. And I feel that on a number of occasions, we allow ourselves to be boundaried by that. We know where we're not supposed to go beyond. Now, I'm conscious if you go too far beyond it, you'll fall off the tightrope altogether and you won't get any chance to go any further. But there is a bit about acknowledging what am I getting constrained by here? What is the acceptable level of dissent, and how can I push an inch or two beyond the acceptable level of dissent? And then lastly, I'd suggest sometimes all of us in these areas need to practice what we preach. where we spend a lot of time creating the conditions for others to organise. We also need to organise ourselves. And can I finish where I started by commending all of you who organised yourselves to come here today, and the Standards Council for Scotland for organising today's events. Thank you very much.